Hello, and welcome to Advancing Energy Efficiency in New Construction, our second webinar in the Levers for Change series. My name is Katie Jones. I'm the Community Program and Policy Manager with the Center for Energy and Environment. We're excited to be talking about tools cities can use for decarbonization, today discussing Energy Code. We hope this will be informative as well as engaging. We'll be asking questions of you throughout our next 60 minutes, so be prepared to be engaged. A quick introduction of who we are. The Center for Energy and Environment, or CEE, is a nonprofit organization that promotes energy efficiency to strengthen the economy while improving the environment, working with homes, businesses, and communities. We touch aspects critical to advancing energy efficiency. We run utility and community programs, conduct cold climate energy efficiency research. We offer consulting to building owners and communities. We work on state and local policy, and finally, we offer financial tools so people can make the upgrades to the buildings they want. All right, getting into it. Let's start today with the link between buildings, energy, and carbon. Of the world's carbon emissions, 39% come from buildings, either from processes to make materials and construct them, or from burning fossil fuels to provide energy to them. It's no denying that our world runs on energy. A question I invite you to ponder is, what is the cleanest kilowatt hour or BTU out there? Natural gas is cleaner than coal, of course. What about wind, solar? As it turns out, the cleanest kilowatt hour is the one that is actually never used. That's why energy efficiency and baking that energy efficiency in at the start of new construction is really important. So why energy efficiency in new construction? Here is a map of the Twin Cities showing the average year built by census block group for the buildings inside that block group. As you can see, our buildings, there are many census tracts here that have the average age of their buildings that are over 100 years old. This shows that buildings stick around for a long time. That means that the decisions that we're making today will essentially impact us for the next decades. And even in highly developed areas like the metro area, we are still seeing new development. Over here on the left is a section of Southwest Minneapolis and Edina. The yellow indicates the new construction that has happened kind of in the last couple of decades. So these are trends that we're seeing and that we'll continue to see. In the middle, this is of more of the Minnetonka area, and on the right shows the kind of 394 corridor near St. Louis Park and Golden Valley. So the way that we bake in energy efficiency in new construction is through the Energy Code. The first Energy Code was adopted in 1980. There's a different path for residential and commercial code, and Russ will touch on more about that. But basically, as you can see here, energy use in new construction buildings as designed have reduced over time. So you can see the left-hand side is the energy use index, essentially the amount of energy that it's expected to use, and then for that year built. And then as we get closer to today, you can see that that modeled building is about 50% more efficient than one that would have been built 40 years ago. Something to know about Minnesota is that our energy code is set at the state level. This is different than in other states. Other states allow for cities to set their own energy code. That's not the case, unfortunately, in Minnesota. And so that's why it's critical for all cities to be engaged kind of at the higher level with the state to help work together and move forward on advancing energy code. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to now go through the agenda. So I'm excited that we'll have Russ Landry here to talk about the Minnesota Energy Code process. Then we'll have Jamie talk about current code legislation that is advancing at the state legislature. And last but not least, we'll have Grace hop on to talk about how cities can improve their code compliance. Love to hear from our audience. What is your level of knowledge on energy codes? So we can make sure that we're providing you with the right level of information.
Hey everyone, this is Molly Janice from CEE, just encouraging you to get your poll response in. Looks like we've got about half of you. I'll go ahead and give you about 5 more seconds and then I'll end the poll. Can you guys see the results?
Don't believe so.
Yep, it sounds like they're just not getting to your screen, Katie, so I'll take over. Looks like about 60% of us are beginners, 30% of us are intermediate, and then we have 1 advanced.
Awesome. Great. So we've got 1 real expert in the room and then a number of others who are looking to learn more. So that's great. So let's go ahead and close that out. I say 1 expert in the room. I'll also add, of course, that Russ is a real expert on energy codes here at CEE for us. So he is a senior mechanical engineer who plays various roles in projects that contribute to cost-effective energy savings in buildings. These roles include securing project funding, project management, building plan review, energy analysis, and conducting field research. I know whenever I have any questions about codes, I go to Russ. So he's going to be talking to us about the process. So go ahead and take it over, Russ.
I appreciate that, Katie, and the chance to talk about this. You can go ahead to the next slide. I'll be covering a lot of materials, a little bit kind of duplicated, kind of focusing in on different areas more. But don't worry, there's not going to be a quiz afterwards, except for whoever said that they're an expert. we may put that person on the spot. But just kind of to start out, I'm going to talk about the code adoption process, not the code itself so much, other than just basically one thing I want to point out from the beginning is that there is 2 different sections of the energy code in Minnesota, and well, essentially everywhere in the country. There's a commercial energy code and a residential energy code. And I wanted to point out that generally the commercial energy code applies to commercial buildings and also to residential buildings that are 3 stories or higher. So essentially apartment buildings, if they're more than 3 floors, then the commercial energy code applies. So that's kind of how those are separated. And now kind of talking about on a high level in terms of what are the different things that feed into the building code development and adoption. Kind of what the different steps are is that there's model code development that happens at the national level, and in some cases to some degree international level. And most of the building codes in Minnesota are put together by the ICC, which is the International Code Council. They call themselves international, but it really doesn't go beyond the US much. And that's the group that puts together. They have both a commercial and a residential energy code. And right now that is what those are both referred to by the Minnesota's energy code. And then ASHRAE is a group that's more of it, and the ICC is more, its members tend to be more city code officials and cities that are the base of their of that group. And ASHRAE is more of an engineering organization, and they developed ASHRAE standard 90.1, which is a commercial energy code. And that's there are some other ASHRAE standards that also work their way into the state's building codes, but that's the one that's most important today. So it kind of how that happens. So in each of these groups puts together a model code, and then they update those every 3 years on a cycle. And then the other kind of step in terms of how things end up in the Minnesota Energy Code is that at the state and federal level, there's rules and regulations, and the state legislature has given the rulemaking authority for the specifics of the building codes, and they've said that the state administration has the authority to develop building codes, and there are some very specific guidelines in federal law and in state legislation about that. And kind of the state legislature can put in very specific items, and that kind of overrules any rulemaking that's done at the lower level. And that the last item here is kind of the adopting and amending the model codes, that's handled in Minnesota by the Department of Labor and Industry. That's what the DLI stands for. And that's the state statutes kind of give that authority to the DLI commissioner. And then he or she can pass that down to the to various staff or other representatives of the Department of Labor and Industry. And in particular, that's handled through the Construction Codes and Licensing Division within DLI. And there's also in statute a Construction Codes Advisory Council who is supposed to be consulted by the DLI commissioner in setting codes. And there's also opportunities for public comment and input during the code development cycle. So just kind of, again, there's these model codes that are set by these national organizations. State legislature has given the Department of Labor and Industry broad authority to set codes in Minnesota. And then there's code adoption process where there's these different players involved at the local level. And generally what they'll do is they'll adopt a model code and then make some what they call amendments or very specific changes to parts of that code. You can advance the slide now. And this is kind of just reviewing and getting into a little bit more detailed requirements, focusing now just on Minnesota, and that the state legislature, again, is given the authority to the DLI commissioner in consultation with the Construction Codes Advisory Council. And the statute doesn't have very many specific requirements, but I know there has been talk, in previous sessions about trying to set very specific requirements in terms of how frequently the codes are updated. Right now, there's very little guidance on that, but then there's a couple of very specific items. For example, for public parking facilities can't be heated. I mean, that's the one thing that touches kind of energy code there, and for the commercial buildings. And then second group I wanted to go into more is the DLI commissioner, and it's more specifically the Construction Codes and Licensing Division director and staff, and kind of what their role is in the building code adoption and amendment. And then first of all, there's policies set for how frequently the codes are updated, and what the process is for doing that. And right now, their policy is that they look at all of the building codes, which is I can't quote exactly the number now, but it's over a dozen different codes that make up the building code in Minnesota. And they generally kind of look at all of those together every 6 years. And then the DLI commissioner and staff also provide impetus for making changes and to the codes and rulemaking actions, in response to things that come up. They also chair, I had mentioned before, the Construction Codes Advisory Council, which is it's a group. I'll get into that more later on the next slide. But the DLI staff or the commissioners chair these advisory groups and the technical advisory groups that we're going to talk about more. And then once they get the results of kind of recommendations from those groups, the commissioner and staff actually draft the rules. And based on the recommendations of those groups, and they can have their own biases in that process as well. Go to the next slide. Now, the Construction Codes Advisory Council is it's meant to be an industry representative group. It has members that are appointed for 4 years, representing different areas of the building industry. There's someone representing building owners, someone's representing commercial construction, someone representing residential contractors, and also code officials on the committee. And that is chaired by a member of the Construction Codes and Licensing Division. Usually it's chaired by the director within the DLI organization. And what they do in terms of the code development is they initiate actions of establishing the technical advisory groups. And these technical advisory groups are kind of another kind of targeted representative group of experts. So typically when the building codes are updated, it used to be every 3 years. Now it's more, it tends to be every 6 years. For each code book, for example, for the energy code, they'd get together a TAG group of maybe half a dozen or maybe a little bit more individuals that are focused just on that area, people that are experts in that. And similarly, there'd be somebody else from the mechanical code and that are experts in that area. And then these groups will have a number of meetings and they'll go through the model code that is being looked at to be adopted, and they'll go through that in detail and look at issues and decide whether or not they think certain amendments should be made if they want it to do anything to make specific requirements either more stringent or less stringent. Historically, when it comes to the energy code, historically the amendments have almost always made the code less stringent rather than more stringent. And then that coming out of those TAG meetings, and each TAG group is also chaired by a member of the DLI staff, administrative staff. And then they kind of put together a report for that and report back to, once each TAG is each advisory group is done going through several meetings, they'll report back to the Construction Codes Advisory Council, who then generally, approves recommendations from the TAG groups. There might be some specific items that this larger group will pick at and maybe make some changes to, but in general, in terms of where the decision making happens, the earlier anyone gets involved in this decision making process and makes recommendations, then the more likely they are to be implemented. So kind of if things are worked in within these TAG groups, generally what the recommendations are tend to carry forward both through the CCAC and then as the DLI staff take those results and work that into a proposed rule and then the formal steps after that. And there are also plenty of opportunities for public comment, both during the CCAC and TAG meetings. Those are all publicly announced ahead of time, and each of those meetings has an opportunity for public comment. They typically ask that somebody let them know ahead of time that they do want to make a public comment. Sometimes it can be difficult to know exactly what's going to be talked about at the meetings to know what to comment on, but there definitely there is always opportunities for comments there. And also there's for the commercial energy code, there's formal solicitation of comments after the TAG report was released for what the process is in place right now for the commercial energy code. And there's another after the state staff have developed the details of the proposed rule and it gets published in the state register. There's another public comment period that's typically at least 60 days. Sorry, I take that back. That can be a shorter period, but then there's a public comment period, and if enough people request a public hearing, then there's a public hearing if people are not accepting of it, just moving forward. Go to the next slide. And starting to get into too much time with the late start, I'm not going to go into great detail over these. I think I already said that the model codes are generally updated the state's codes are generally updated every 6 years, and those tend to be like 2 years after a model code is updated. And DLI likes to try to do all the updates at once. I talked about, I'm not going to get into details of where we're at, but I do want to talk about now on the federal statutes. And these are very specific, talk about some items that are very specific to the energy code that are different from the other codes. First of all, for the commercial energy codes, federal statute says that when after a new version of ASHRAE 90.1 is issued, then the Department of Energy has 1 year to release a determination of whether or not there's energy savings compared to the previous version of ASHRAE 90.1. And they can do it quicker than a year if they so choose. And if they make a determination that the new version does provide energy savings compared to the previous version, then the states are supposed to be updating their energy code to the same level of efficiency as that new version of ASHRAE 90.1 within 2 years of when the Department of Energy makes their determination. So I know Katie had highlighted how some states are far behind that. So they're not meeting the federal statute in terms of what the enforcement and penalties for not meeting that statute. And that's another matter, but there is this federal requirement that this happen. And on the residential energy code side, there's something similar, but not nearly as forceful. Again, DOE makes a determination after a new residential code is issued by ICC. And if there is savings, then states have 2 years to decide if it's appropriate for them to update that energy code. They don't need to, but they just have to, they have just required to submit something saying that they are or they are not updating the code and why not. And there must be a public hearing before that decision is made and the write-up published. And there, one other thing I wanted to mention on the slide is Minnesota statute has some very specific requirements for the residential energy code, separate from its guidance for all the other codes, because there was some, and in residential energy code is a lot more of a political football than the commercial energy codes, but there's a specific requirement that the residential energy code can't be updated without there being research completed in cooperation with practitioners in residential construction and building science, that studying issues, because there had been issues with moisture in buildings when envelopes were tightened up without and not done in an appropriate way. So that was kind of a backlash from that. And also the statute requires that the Construction Codes and Advisory Council makes an affirmative recommendation that a new residential model code be adopted. For all the other codes in general, the CCAC just has to be consulted by the DLI commissioner, but for the residential code in particular, the CCAC has to make that recommendation. Go to the next slide. And I'm just going to kind of go through where things stand right now in terms of the adoption of the commercial energy code in Minnesota. On the top is showing kind of at the national level what the direction is that the new version of ASHRAE 90.1, it's labeled the 2019 version, was published in October of 2019, and DOE took more than their year, but finally in July of 2021 they made their determination that there's savings of greater than 4% for that standard. So then that started the timeline of 2 years. Up until for when Minnesota must certify that it has adopted and updated its energy code as necessary to be equivalent to that 2019 version of ASHRAE 90.1. And now on the bottom, we're going to talk about more Minnesota specific developments. Minnesota's current energy code went into effect in 2020, and that code references the 2016 version of ASHRAE 90.1 and also IECC's commercial, but that's I'm not going to get into details on that. What happened is at the beginning of since then, in the beginning of 2021, the State Department staff and the CCAC had decided to start the process for moving forward with towards adopting the ASHRAE 90.1 2019, even before the DOE determination. So they're actually more aggressive in terms of updating the code than they had been in the past, and they're not waiting for the normal 6-year cycle of what they do for all their other codes. So they're looking at doing this after 3 years instead. And then there was technical advisory groups were started and held in early 2021. And then a report from those technical advisory group meetings was posted in July of 2021, and that was published and it was available for public review and comment. And then in October of last year, in the state register, there was an official notice of the state's intent to adopt ASHRAE 90.1 2019 as its new commercial energy code. It didn't have any details about what amendments would be to that energy code, but just that they're going to adopt that. And they had allowed for at least 60 days of comment between then and when the draft rules would be published. And right now we're on February 23rd, and it's been well over 60 days. The latest news I had was when I was told late last fall is that this would be published in early, in early 2022, and it hasn't come out yet. But once that is published, then there's 30 days for there to be a hearing. There are 30 days of comment for people to request a hearing, and if there's a minimum threshold of people requesting a hearing, then there'll be a hearing. And the targeted date for effectiveness of the code is going to be March of 2023. Now I can move on. I'm just going to point out in the residential energy code, we're in a much different timeline here, and that there's going to be a public hearing just in terms of whether or not the state should move towards the adoption of a new energy code for residential buildings. And then it's a long time before any specifics would be discussed. And now moving on. So to talk about opportunities for public input. Again, and the sooner you get involved in the process, the better. And I need to wrap things up here. So, but really the best, most detailed input can be provided at the Construction Codes Advisory Council, and especially the technical advisory group meetings. So following those, if there's specific issues and things that you want to look for pushing for more efficiency, those are the times to get involved. And you go to the next slide. And this is the context for how you can kind of get on mailing lists. And the first list is for the being able to, is for the based on what was published in the register in terms of here's who to contact for comments on the commercial energy code adoption. And that's still open for comment up until the new rules, the draft rules are published in the register. And you can also get on the mailing list for the Construction Codes Advisory Council and Construction Codes and Licensing Division by contacting Lindy Logan at DLI. Thanks very much. And with that, I'll pass it to back to Katie.
Awesome. Thank you, Russ. I know no one knows the process better than you. So, and just, I know that was probably a lot for folks. So we'll be, we're doing a recording of this as well as going to be making the PowerPoint slides available. So next we're going to be moving on to current codes legislation. Jamie Fitzke, who is our Director of Legislative Affairs, is going to be talking about this. She works to protect Minnesota's deep commitment to energy efficiency and to also create and advocate for smart energy policy with Minnesota legislatures. She uses her experience in program implementation, energy efficiency, and energy policy to build relationships and promote CEE's mission and impact. I'll just turn it over to Jamie now.
Thank you, Katie. And also thank you, Russ. I always feel like I learn so much from you whenever you give a presentation on codes. Really appreciate it. Let's go to the next slide, please. So as maybe many of you could be aware, particularly cities, over the last about 3 to 4 years, there's been an effort, particularly through some Minnesota cities, and then also in coordination with the Department of Labor and Industry and the trades, to look at ways that Minnesota could advance their energy, specifically their energy code legislation. Some cities would like to put together the opportunity or the option for them to advance their energy codes. There are quite a few cities here in the state that have decarbonization goals or climate goals, and codes would be one way to help them achieve this. So back in 2020 and 2021, there was some codes legislation that was introduced. Now there's going to be a slight change from what was originally proposed. And this is mainly to acknowledge that there have been some changes from the political side and recognizing what might be possible with the current legislature. So that legislative update here is posted. What it would do, or what it says, is a municipality may adopt the most recently published new model commercial energy code, ASHRAE 90.1, until such a time that a more energy efficient code is adopted by the commissioner. Municipalities may not amend or otherwise change a provision of the most recent ASHRAE 90.1 standard, except that they are required to adopt amendments to the previous version of ASHRAE 90.1 in the current commercial energy code adopted by the commissioner. So kind of in just call it layman's terms, what this is looking to do is to allow cities the opportunity to opt in, and it would be optional, to optionally adopt ASHRAE 90.1 once the DOE has certified it that it has energy savings. So that timeline that Russ had showed earlier was really helpful to show the gap, that 2-year time period that can elapse. Cities would often be able to move at a much faster time frame. So as soon as ASHRAE 90.1, the newest model code, was certified from the Department of Energy, then cities would be able to adopt that and have that be their energy code. Next slide, please. And coincidentally, as fate would have it, tomorrow morning, the bill HF 831, which is the language that was shown earlier, there will be a hearing for that in the House Energy and Climate Committee. The bill is authored by Representative Long. The amended language is posted in case you go to the site and want to take a look at it. I would encourage, if you are interested in supporting this, please feel free to submit written or verbal testimony. That's pretty easy to do, where a city or individual or organization can simply say that they support this bill, and they would just email it to the committee assistant, the CA, which is listed on the website. Additionally, if you are interested in showing support and all of this sounds super complicated, feel free to just email me. Happy to help you through the process. So that is one area right now, or one place of movement for the energy codes. If the bill is heard successfully tomorrow, then the next step would be to hopefully get a Senate hearing. The conversations are ongoing there. We're hoping that Senator Senjum, who is the lead author for the original bill, will take some time to take a look at this new language, and maybe with this new language, there could be some forward movement on this. And then too, what I would really like to do is encourage engagement. Depending on your organization, or if you're with a city, you likely have some government affairs staff. Additionally, some people have contract lobbyists that work at the Capitol. And then too, I would greatly encourage conversations between cities and organizations. This is really helpful to get the word out about this legislation, discuss any concerns, but then also discuss areas of support. And I would greatly encourage reaching out to your legislators if you have the capacity to do so. And that would wrap it up from me here. And again, happy to take any questions. And if you need any either interpretations or any contacts to show support for this legislation, we'd be happy to help.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jamie. We'll keep rolling here. We've got another poll for the group. So if Molly, you wouldn't mind bringing that up. Got a question on, how does your community currently support new construction efforts? When we're defining community, either by if you're a city or if you are with an organization in this case. So maybe you haven't supported beyond code requirements at this point, but you generally support it, just haven't allocated any resources, maybe you provide training, maybe you have a formal sustainable building policy. Or you don't have a formal policy, and instead you include it as part of your negotiations for TIF or other city things. Or maybe you're a consultant in the area. We'd love to hear about that as well.
Great, it looks like we're getting some responses. This is Molly from CEE again. We've got about half of you participating. Give you 10 seconds before we end the poll. And just in case you can't see the results, we have about a third of you have not supported beyond code requirements. Another third don't have a formal policy, but have often included those requirements as part of negotiations. And then just under that, we have that some of you provide training to building professionals. Some of you have a sustainable building policy, and then some of you provide consulting services for new construction. So thanks so much for playing along. Katie, do you want to grab a screenshot of that?
Mm-hmm. I just
Great.
did. Thank you so much. Oops.
All right.
Let's keep on moving. We'll take it or move it over to Grace. So Grace works on, she's a program manager for a code compliance program. And so we'll be providing information on how to improve code compliance here in Minnesota.
Thanks, Katie. Go to the next slide. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about code compliance, and I'll start out by just kind of touching on why code compliance support is needed. In a 2020 Slipstream study, they found that there's about 73 gigawatt hours and 3.3 million therms of lost energy savings potential in new commercial construction. Basically, what that means is that if I could wave a magic wand and make all new construction this year 100% compliant with the energy code, that's how much energy we would save. The same study found that new construction is about 70 to 85% compliant with the code. And that's just comparing basically any building that's at all non-compliant to fully compliant, just to give a little transparency to that number. The reason why this happens is multifaceted. There's one big issue is that code officials have a lot on their plate. They're responsible for enforcing a lot of life safety codes, building code, fire code, and they can be pretty time and resource restricted. The energy code is really complex. Even experts take quite a bit of time to review some energy code projects to ensure for full compliance. And most code officials don't have that time. They are working against strict deadlines. And then because there's not a lot of enforcement, we see that the design community sometimes doesn't know the full complexities of the energy code as well. So there's just a lot of layers that kind of contribute to this lack of compliance in Minnesota and really across the nation too. We can go to the next slide, Katie. So before I get into things, I just wanted to go over some useful language that I'll be touching on. Within the energy code, there are multiple pathways that you can take to achieve compliance. And within, I'll go kind of into a little more detail on the next slide. It gets kind of complex, but at a high level, there is a prescriptive and a performance path. The prescriptive path is kind of as it sounds. There's basically a list of requirements that buildings have to achieve, like your windows have to have a certain insulation value and your walls have to have a certain insulation value. Your HVAC system has to be sized a certain way. That's all kind of in the prescriptive side of things. But buildings can also opt to take this performance path, which basically requires buildings to conduct two energy models. They model their building as if it were designed to the prescriptive code, and then they model it again the way that they'd like to design it. And they have to show that the building will consume less energy as designed than it would if they just met the prescriptive code requirements. And so that's kind of a way for some more complex buildings that maybe want to have more windows than the code would require. They could have more windows, but they need to, compensate by having higher wall insulation or something like that. We can go to the next slide. So this slide is super complex. I'm not going to get into the weeds on this, but this diagram just kind of shows how the Minnesota Energy Code works. There's basically kind of two buckets that you can fall into for compliance, the ASHRAE bucket and the IACC bucket. And then within those, there are those prescriptive and performance paths that I just touched on. And this is actually a one-pager that we created that lists all of the different pathways and where the requirements exist in the code book and what the required documentation are for each. And I'll talk about this later on, but we've developed a couple other resources like this that I'd be happy to share for anyone who's interested. It basically just kind of simplifies, or maybe not simplifies, but lays the code out in a visual way, which I know is helpful for some of us visual thinkers. So we can go to the next slide. So in order to kind of solve this problem or address noncompliance, there have been a lot of different intervention strategies that we have tried and that others throughout the nation have tried in order to improve commercial code compliance. One is support for code officials. This can look a lot of different ways. One way is supplemental third-party plan review. So that could be serving as kind of an energy code expert and looking at building plans at the time of permitting and checking for energy code compliance as a way to support code officials who may not have the time or expertise to do a comprehensive energy code plan review. Another way is by, and this kind of fits into the third one here, but doing trainings and material development to simplify the energy code or help building officials achieve a more comprehensive understanding of the code. And this is especially helpful when new code cycles are adopted, because there's often a lot of changes to the code and it's really hard to stay up to date with the new changes. And so trainings can be really helpful there. Another is construction industry engagement. So that would be like your architects, engineers that are actually designing the building, making sure that they're aware of the newest updates to the code and just supporting them in the same way. And then, I mean, I kind of touched on this with both, but just general training and material development. There's a lot of materials that can overlap both code officials and construction industry. And then there's materials that can be developed that target each. And doing trainings is a really great way to just kind of improve industry knowledge of the energy code. Next slide. So I just wanted to take a moment to talk about our 2016 commercial code support pilot. I actually didn't work on this project, but Russ did, who you just heard from. And this pilot took two different approaches to improve energy code compliance. One was design team support. So this was working with design teams on small, simple buildings, providing just technical support, design review, to help ensure that they were meeting the code, and we would provide an incentive to any design teams that participated. The second approach was plan reviewer support. So that's something that I mentioned on the last slide. We looked at large complex buildings being permitted and created kind of a compliance report for city staff. And that just kind of provided an extra level of expertise during the permitting phase specific to energy code. Next slide. This slide shows the breakdown of some of the results that we saw during that study based on envelope, mechanical, and electrical. You'll see that the yellow is insufficient information, which will kind of play into what I'm going to talk about next. But there is a lot of noncompliance on the electrical side. We see the most compliance in envelope, and this could be because envelope has a lot of pretty clear prescriptive requirements, like I was just saying about windows have to have a certain U value, things like that are a little bit easier for people to wrap their head around, you could say. And we'll go to the next slide. So the places that we see the most challenges through our code compliance work are, I tried to kind of simplify them into three main buckets of documentation, consistency, and redundancy. What I mean by documentation, there's on that complex kind of slide that I showed, we listed the required documentation for each energy code pathway, and it does change based on what pathway you take. And for example, within the prescriptive path, you can do an envelope trade-off where you have to run a ComCheck report. And we want to make sure that everything listed in that ComCheck report matches the construction drawings to ensure that the building is actually being designed the way that it was modeled. So that's kind of one piece, and that goes into the consistency side of things. It's really important that there isn't just like a code sheet, a code summary sheet that says, oh, all windows will be this U value. It's really important that that is consistent throughout construction documentation, listed in the specifications, making sure that it's because when you're building the building, the people who are picking out the windows aren't just going to look at the codes page, they're going to look at the specifications. And so we really want to make sure that the building is actually going to be built the way that it is, the way that it should. And then redundancy is kind of, again, aligned with those other two pieces. We want to see things in multiple places. So if the U value is only listed on the codes page and it's not listed anywhere else, then it's possible that nobody's going to see that and they're just going to pick whatever window they want. And so redundancy is really, really important as well, to make sure that things appear both in the construction drawings and the specifications. So that's just another piece that we see. And overarching, I would say one of the other big challenges that we encounter is performance path projects, because you are required to provide modeling reports and some pretty complex pieces to support your performance path. It takes a lot of time to look through and verify that a modeling report was done correctly. And it takes a lot of expertise. You know, you don't necessarily know what you're looking at. And a lot of times, if there's an engineer stamp on it, your code official is just going to approve it because they trust that the engineer has, you know, checked it for to make sure that it is accurate. And so this is a piece that we have found through code support programs where we do third-party plan review. That is a piece that we find is especially helpful for code officials, to be able to have somebody who is able to review those complex energy modeling reports. We can go to the next slide. And lastly, I was just going to make a plug. We have developed some materials through our work to help with understanding the energy code, including, I'll just go through these really quickly. I know we're almost out of time here, but that far left document is a quick reference guide. This lists out about 30 energy code measures and when they apply and what the requirement is. And so this is a really useful resource for design teams or for code officials, because it just kind of puts some really important energy code requirements in one place. And there's two separate versions for the IACC and ASHRAE versions. The middle document you see is a commissioning specific one pager. We developed this for a ICC Technical Institute kind of trade show. And it just basically touches on the importance of commissioning and ways that you can check to ensure that commissioning happens and what the code actually says is required. And then the third one on the far right is the image that I showed earlier, and it's basically just a visual interpretation of the Minnesota Energy Code. And if you would like PDF copies of any of these, I'd be happy to share them. Just send me an email and I can send them along. And I think we have about 4 minutes left for Q&A. So I'll hand it back to you, Katie.
Awesome. Thank you, Grace. So yeah, back to those resources. Well, actually, before I get there, yeah, to those resources. Yeah, if you are with a city or work with design teams and you would like these, please, tap us and utilize these as much as you can, so we can make sure that energy code is more accessible to those who are working on it. As we close out here, if you want to open it up for Q&A. I know we started late, so I'm willing to stick on for a little bit over. I'm hoping our speakers will be as well. While we're doing Q&A, I would like to ask if you wouldn't mind popping in the chat. Name one thing from this webinar that was interesting or new to you. We always love to hear what was impactful, so we can keep those in mind as we keep developing these webinars. So if there are any questions, also happy for people to just unmute and ask them.
I wanted to surface Luke's question from Minneapolis on, and Russ, maybe you just wanted to speak to your points quickly. And I'd love Jamie's perspective as well, since this is potentially legislative in nature.
Yeah, so it looks like, go ahead.
What exactly was the question you wanted me to address? I didn't follow that.
Oh, I was just.
I can ask it directly.
Go ahead, Luke.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Luke Holland, Campus City, Minneapolis. The question was, Grace, when you were talking about whether you can go, or that buildings have the option of going through a prescriptive or a performance path, my question was if a city could require one of those paths specifically. My thinking was just if as a city you're required going down the performance path, then it's much more like, well, then energy modeling needs to occur. It's much more likely that energy modeling may occur as a part of a utility incentive program, which would help educate the design team, as well as hopefully maximize the incentives that are actually realized by that building for energy efficient design. So that was kind of my question, if that authority currently exists outside of any new legislation.
Not the way I understand it. I think that the cities are required to allow any path that is noted in the code. And I also want to point out in terms of that it requiring the performance path puts a lot of forces a lot of extra work and documentation and all kinds of things to be done by the project team, even beyond what would be done by a typical EDA. Even though going through EDA provides some simulation. When we look at simulations, the EDA programs aren't meant to document performance path, meaning energy code performance path requirements. They have a whole different purpose, and they tend to not be as detailed and specific to a final building design as what typically a energy simulations that would be used just to document code compliance would be. They're more geared towards helping people decide early on what are the best design features to choose for a building, which is fantastic in terms of encouraging people to see the different energy efficiency routes and the paybacks that they can get from that. But in terms of using that for leveraging that for energy code compliance, it's kind of it's different than what those programs are designed for, and it's in what the simulations that are done in those reports don't necessarily match up with the final designs.
And just to add on there, I'm not aware if cities would or wouldn't would be within the legal rights to make a determination on one way or the other.
Yeah, and this is, I didn't want to put this in writing in the comments either, but I'm not going to point to any particular projects, but sometimes it almost feels like design development teams go the route, it seems like that they'll go the route of the performance path and maybe to just kind of overwhelm the building officials too. And as was said, let me just look for the engineer signature and just say, okay, it'll be on you as the engineer to have the responsibility to make sure that this performance path project does meet it. But yeah, unfortunately, we've seen a lot of inaccuracies, even in terms of the simpler ComCheck reports that Grace had talked about. But when you get to the energy simulations, there's a lot of different ways that things can be tweaked to kind of make things look a little better or worse. And some of it's, I think, just accidental misrepresentations based on the level of effort, but there certainly is potential to make things look better than they are if there's not someone doing a really good look and review of that documentation.
And Russ, it is much more likely that a project goes through the prescriptive path than performance, correct?
Yeah, so that's what we've seen more often, especially for smaller buildings. They're going to go the prescriptive path more, the performance path. It seems like it's more the case for larger buildings, or if there are one or two particular items in the prescriptive path that for their project they feel like it's too expensive to do this or that, and they can save money and get the same level of performance by making up for it somewhere else. Then the performance path kind of gives them that flexibility.
Cool. Well, thank you for that. I know we are over time, so I want to be respectful for everyone, for everyone's time. And just thank you all for coming. and for dealing with our little technical issue before. We are going to be hosting another webinar next month, focusing on equitable and green jobs. And so I hope you'll join us for that. And otherwise, just thank you again. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. So thanks so much, and we'll see you again next time.